So there was nothing exceptional about the British involvement in slavery in...
Wait, what? What? Did he just say what I think he said? Dude, around 12 million Africans were enslaved in the course of the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported around 3.4 million Africans across the Atlantic. Literally a third of all African slaves that were enslaved from Africa were taken by the British. My man said there was nothing exceptional about British involvement in this slave trade. I don't know what to say at this point. Historian reveals the truth about slavery. This is one of my favorite things in the whole world when conservatives do apologia for slavery, specifically European-style chattel slavery. I'm gonna bet this video is going to be a lot of things like pointing out that like slavery existed in other places around the world. He'll probably talk about how like slaves own slaves, things like that. Pretty typical stuff. I'm wondering if there's going to be anything new, maybe that we haven't heard before. That's why I want to check this video out. But there are a lot of like pretty prototypical talking points that conservatives bring up when it comes to trying to backdoor defend European-style chattel slavery. And so let's see what this is all about from our good friends at Trigonometry.
13% of the total manpower of the Royal Navy was devoted to stopping slave ships leaving West Africa for the Americas. Just stopping that, quite apart from stopping slavery elsewhere.
Right off the bat, we're like, the British were actually the good guys when it came to slavery. Okay.
Slavery and trading in slaves was a universal institution almost from the dawn of time.
Okay. I hate to go like full on Pazanabi here, but I already know I'm going to need to debunk this claim at some point in this video, so I guess we may as well do it now. It's 100% true that slavery was not unique to Europeans in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, or Americans, you know, later on, and that's 100% a historical fact. All sorts of civilizations throughout history have practiced some form of slavery or forced servitude, but that ignores several key factors. One, it doesn't give the transatlantic slave trade a pass. It was still horrible, and like our European ancestors or whatever did those things. Two, while like, yes, all slavery is bad, there are degrees to how bad it can be. And European-style, American-style chattel slavery was particularly fucking brutal. For example, let's take the Romans. It's well known that in ancient Rome, slavery was a fairly common, well-understood practice. However, there are many important differences between how the Romans did it and European-style chattel slavery. For example, right off the bat, Roman slavery allowed for some levels of social mobility. In ancient Roman society, slaves could actually earn or buy their freedom. And unlike, you know, our slavery, they and their children could become Roman citizens. This concept of becoming free was basically unheard of during the time of the, you know, transatlantic slave trade. The other key factor is the sheer scale of the transatlantic slave trade. And I guess, like, the other factor that I think is also very important, but again, not to diminish any other form of slavery, they're all bad, but unlike ancient Roman slavery, we're still experiencing the systemic effects of the transatlantic slave trade. So trying to equate the transatlantic slave trade to virtually any other form of slavery that has existed in human history is not only inaccurate, but it also overlooks the continuing legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. The sheer scale, the brutality, and the dehumanization that occurred during that particular slave trade is, as far as I know from a historical perspective, fairly unprecedented. The thing that conservatives don't understand is that it's not just about acknowledging various atrocities of the past, but also about understanding the long-lasting impact they've had on racial and economic disparities today. That's the other thing I don't quite understand is, like, what is your point by saying other people did slavery? What are you accomplishing by saying that? It's just not an accurate statement to say, well, everyone did it. The transatlantic slave trade was particularly brutal, and its effects its systemic effects are still felt today.
So long before Europeans got into it, and the Portuguese were the first in the 1440s, in terms of trading in Africans. Although there was slavery, I mean, Bristol was a slave market in the medieval period. Yeah. Irish slaves being traded to Norsemen, who then took them down the Volga to the Black Sea.
Oh my God. I just love the cut to like Dumb and Dumber here. Like blank stares. They're also like sitting in the exact same position. The amount of riz exuding from this photograph. Again, not to at all defend these other forms of slavery, but you just, can't equate these things. The transatlantic slave trade was particularly brutal. It was particularly racist. And acknowledging that and the subsequent systemic effects that we still experience today from that slave trade is important.
So there's lots of slave trading.
Yeah, like exactly what I was just talking about. You can't just be like, there was lots of slave trading. It's disingenuous to do that. And I think this guy understands that. And if he doesn't, he's a fucking idiot.
Around Europe, but also Africans were involved in trading other Africans as slaves to the Romans.
Bro. And then... Oh, okay. Well, we just talked about Roman slavery and how it, again, just not the same thing. To summarize, like, there was social mobility, your children weren't slaves. There's a million reasons why Roman-style slavery is not at all similar to the transatlantic slave trade. Not to justify Roman slavery. Please understand, I'm not trying to do that. But again, it's apples and oranges.
And then to the Muslim Arabs. The Comanche, the Amerindian people who dwelt in the southwest of what's now the United States, according to one eminent historian, ran a vast slave economy in the 1700s.
Dude, it's more of the same shit. Once again, it is true that slavery existed in Native American tribes. That is a historical fact. However, again, what they are leaving out is that their style of slavery, all slavery is bad, but their style of slavery was very different from the chattel slavery that was used in the transatlantic slave trade. As in Roman slavery, as far as I know, in a lot of these Native American tribes, being a slave was not a lifelong thing. Slaves could often earn their freedom and become regular members of the tribe, just as you could become a Roman citizen in their form of slavery. From my very limited knowledge about history, a lot of the times these slaves were taken in times of war and were often used to, replace members of their tribe that they lost in those wars. In addition, like with the Roman slavery, your kids usually weren't born as slaves. Unlike in the transatlantic slave trade, where if you were a slave, your kids would be one too.
And then in the 1700s in Jamaica, when slaves escaped from the plantations and went into the forested interior, the mountainous interior of Jamaica, they were called Maroons. They often held slaves of their own. And I was in.
Is that true? I've heard of the Maroons. I'm sure a lot of people have. I would fact check that, and maybe I'll do it in the edit. I don't have a ton of time to do it right now, but I will probably fact check that. But even if that's the case, it's still completely misleading to compare anything that would have happened there to chattel slavery. Chattel slavery specifically refers to treating people as property that can be bought and sold. That is a separate level of dehumanization that other forms of slavery did not have, going for them. And once again, nothing he has said here could serve in any way as a justification for the transatlantic slave trade.
Raleigh, North Carolina in January, visiting my wife's family there, and I went to the Museum of the History of North Carolina, which told me that on the eve of the American Civil War in 1860, there were 30,000 freed slaves in the state of North Carolina, some of whom owned slaves of their own.
Dude, this is like baby brain shit. This is like 101 level, you need to be either the dumbest person alive, like these two, or operating in such horrific levels of bad faith to completely misconstrue history here. Let's unpack this too. While it is true that there were freed black people in the South who owned slaves, from what I understand, in many of these cases, freed black slaves actually purchased members of their own family or like friends to free them, to protect them. The very existence of black slave owners doesn't negate the overwhelmingly white power structure that upheld and benefited from chattel slavery. And in some ways, it kind of sounds like when you make this argument, you're trying to like deflect from the inherent racial nature of American chattel slavery. This was a system that was designed to maintain and reinforce the power of a white ruling class.
And my point is, we have to accept the fact that for many people, even former slaves, owning slaves was acceptable.
Again, I think I've said all that needs to be said to debunk that statement, but it is crazy that he's just saying this shit out loud.
Or normal. And even if you might well, if you were in the 18th century, 19th century, you might...
He's got the, like, I'm bullshitting face on. I know this is, like, you know, like, reading body language and shit, and you're not supposed to do that, but, like, I'm getting, like, the, like, I'm knowingly bullshitting from his expression here. I'm gonna admit it.
Might well object to cruel and inhuman forms of slavery, and yet still think that slavery was a kind of a fact of life. So we just have to accept that and get our heads around it. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone until us was morally corrupt and morally insensitive. So that's one thing.
So that's the truth about slavery? The truth about slavery is other people had slavery? That's not the fucking own you think it is, bro.
So there was nothing exceptional about the British involvement in slavery in...
Wait, what?
In the 17th and 18th centuries.
What? Did he just say what I think he said?
Morally insensitive. So that's one thing. So there was nothing exceptional about the British involvement in slavery in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Dude. Around 12 million Africans were enslaved in the course of the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported around 3.4 million Africans across the Atlantic. Literally a third of all African slaves that were enslaved from Africa were taken by the British. My man said there was nothing exceptional about British involvement in this slave trade. I don't know what to say at this point. That's insane. And it kind of goes back to what I said in a recent video I made. Like, with conservatives, you can just say whatever, and there will be no repercussions for you. Your audience will never fact check what you say. You can say anything, no matter how utterly disconnected from reality it is, and your audience will believe it. They got it so easy, dude. The truth is, Britain had a huge part in the transatlantic slave trade. They were not the first to do slavery, and they were not the last to do slavery. But holy shit, were they one of the worst to do slavery. Jesus Christ, dude. I almost can't believe he said that, to the point where, you know, maybe I'm taking him out of context and we'll see what he says, you know, after this. But holy shit.
What was exceptional and extraordinary was that toward the end of the 18th century, partly because of Enlightenment views, mainly because of Christian views, the idea that owning other human beings as property began to be questioned on principle.
Bro, literally, the Bible allows for slavery. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So, if I'm remembering correctly, it's basically saying you can't have fellow Israelites as slaves, but everyone else is fair game. It's literally y'all's book that a lot of these people used to justify slavery in this time. Again, I don't know what I'm missing here. He is just either the dumbest Oxford professor who's ever lived, or he is intentionally misconstruing shit to like build some bizarre transatlantic slave trade apologia narrative. This is really strange to me. Like, as strange as I thought this video was going to be, this is kind of stranger than I thought it was going to be, straight up.
And so in 1787, you get the creation of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in England. I think Denmark was the first state in Europe to abolish the slave trade within its limited territories. Britain followed 3 years later, 1807. And then in 1833, the empire abolished slavery as an institution within its territories. So let me just make this clear, because at the moment, in recent years, we've been encouraged in Britain to look again at the horrors of slavery, in which our ancestors were involved for 150, 200 years, as if nothing had changed. So the fact that Britain was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish the slave trade and then to abolish slavery, and it then led the world in suppressing both of those, as I said, from Brazil across Africa to Malaysia.
Okay. Some of the stuff he's saying here is true. But again, like, the way a lot of conservatives do this, the way he's framing it is suspect. To me, it sounds as though he's claiming that, like, the abolition of slavery in Britain somehow, like, diminishes or, like, erases their participation in this slave trade. This is a deeply flawed argument. Why? Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and its abolition efforts are not mutually exclusive. They were among the first nations to technically ban it in its entirety. However, that fact does not, as I said, erase the fact that they were also heavily involved in it for like 200 years. As we just learned, they were among the world's largest slave trading powers and played a significant role in its expansion. On top of that, as we've already discussed, the wealth and power that Britain accrued during that time has had long-lasting effects, which you can see in the form of systemic inequalities that are still visible today. We should acknowledge Britain's role in ending the transatlantic slave trade, but that does not absolve them of their role in perpetuating it. We need to recognize the full complexity of this history as it relates to our world today. And that is something that conservatives simply cannot do.
That was extraordinary. No other state had done that before. No other states had done that before. Certainly not in Africa, certainly not in Asia, nor among the indigenous peoples of North America. That was extraordinary. And we carried on doing that for until the end of the empire in the 1960s. And in the 1820s and 30s, the slave trade department in the British Foreign Office was the largest unit. And in the 1830s or 40s, thereabouts, 13% of the total manpower of the Royal Navy was devoted to stopping slave ships leaving West Africa for the Americas.
Dude, yes. As I just described, yes, those things happened. But in no way does that absolve them. Does that clean their hands of what happened? On top of that, we're still feeling the effects of that slave trade today, and the countries that were built upon the backs of these slaves have done nothing in regard to helping the communities that were affected by this slave trade, communities that are still existing today. So I don't really get his overall point.
Just stopping that, quite apart from stopping slavery elsewhere, So I do think we need to remember the fact that we couldn't undo what we'd done for 200 years worth of enslaving.
Sure. Good statement. I'm glad he at least said that.
All we could do was stop it and then try and stop it elsewhere.
Yeah, but again, even that statement alone there ignores so much. It is frustrating that conservatives can just, again, say whatever they want, make shit up on the spot, and nobody will ever hold them accountable.